So I've heard that people like it when the pastor shares personal stories, especially ones that embarrass himself. So, if for those of you who feel like that, I'm going to give you what you want this morning. This is a good morning for you. I've told stories before about my teenage years, how I was a very, very conscientious kid who was obsessed with doing the right thing, never doing the wrong thing. When I was 14 years old, part of that whole conscientious streak was that I made a resolution that I would never drink a drop of alcohol in my entire life. And my dad, I think, had I don't know if he'd made a resolution, but he had never had any alcohol. My mom was quite scandalous. She would have a glass of wine once every 2 years or so, and I knew I didn't want to end up like that. So I made this resolution, never ever, I'm never not going to have a drop of alcohol for the rest of my life. And I took this very seriously. So I was in high school, and my mom would often pack granola bars in my lunch. And then one day, I look at the granola bar package, and I see that one of the ingredients in the granola bars is something called chocolate liqueur. And I'm like, well, that can't happen anymore, Mom. You can't be packing me these evil granola bars. People trying to get kids drunk on granola bars. I'm not going to be part of that. So no more granola bars for me. If I ever heard that a meat that I was eating had been marinated in like red wine, nope, not going to touch that stuff. I mean, I was strict about this. Now, I'll just kind of skip ahead quite a ways and just tell you, when I was in my early 20s, I decided that resolution was probably not based on the most solid of premises, and so I now feel free to have a drink every now and then. I've never been drunk, but just to have a drink now and then. Anyways, that's beside the point. Back to the story. When I'm in Bible college, 18 years old, first year in Bible college, and we were taking a church history class. And part of this church history class was that we went to this little, I think it might have been like an Orthodox church maybe. We go to this church, and the whole idea here was to kind of familiarize ourselves with the ancient expressions of church. So you go to an Orthodox church and you see how things were done, like 1,000, 1,500 years ago, whatever it was. So we're there. And it's very different for all of us first-year Bible college students. And if you come from a tradition like that, from an Orthodox or Catholic kind of tradition, first of all, I need to warn you that this story may offend you. And it's not on purpose. It's not because I want to, and it's with good purposes. But anyways, I just need to warn you about that. But if you're part of that, if you're from a tradition like that, you'll know that the center of the service, the most important part of the service in an Orthodox church is not the sermon, it's the Eucharist, it's communion, it's the Lord's Supper. Whatever you want to call it, that is the central, most important aspect. So at the end of this service at this Orthodox church, we're all everybody kind of gets up, and the priest is serving the Eucharist, and all of us are like, what do we do? Should we do this? Should we go up there and participate in this? Like, we are all followers of Jesus. We normally take the Lord's Supper. Should we do it? And we go, okay, yeah, let's take this. So we go up, we form the file, we get in there, and the priest holds this tray underneath your chin. And this is the first time we've ever seen anything like this. And we're not sure what to do with it. But the class genius, the guy who only gets A's, I think he got 1 B+, and it's because that professor just randomly gave grades to people, we're pretty sure. So he got all A's, he's class genius, and he goes first. So we're all watching what he does. And he goes up to the tray, and he does he genuflects, and then he kisses the tray. It's like this holy ornament that you're supposed to show respect to. Now, we found out later that it's just supposed to catch the drips from your mouth. That's the whole purpose. Not supposed to kiss it. But we're all kissing it now because the class genius kissed the golden tray. And so we're all doing it, and the priest is looking at us like, what is wrong with these people? What is going on here? And then it's my turn. I get up there, and the priest takes the piece of bread, and he dips it in the wine, and then he puts it in my mouth. And at this moment, it strikes me that this is not grape juice. All my life up to this point, communion was a safe place. It was not a place where my strong convictions were tested. And yet here, for the first time in my life, alcohol has touched my lips. It's in my mouth now. What do I do? Well, I'll tell you what I did. I went back to my seat, and I did not swallow. that bread and that juice, it stayed in my mouth. I shut down my throat. Nothing was going down there. I think we did like a Gregorian chant after that, and I just kind of mumbled my way through it or whatever. And I'm just like, I don't know what I'm going to do here. I can't swallow this. So as soon as the service was over, and this is the part that's going to offend some of you. As soon as the service was over, I'm like, I got to get rid of this. And so I went outside and I spit out communion. What I mean, just to like what Orthodox Christians would have believed to be the literal body and blood of Jesus, I went outside and I spit it out. Because I was so strongly convinced I am not going to drink any alcohol at all. Now, strangely, we never got invited back to that Orthodox church. That was the last time I think that us as a school were able to go there. But anyways, the truth is, this thing that we call Eucharist or the Lord's Supper or communion, it's divisive. It has been divisive throughout the history of the church, based on all kinds of questions. For example, what is it actually? What is the bread and what is the wine or juice or whatever? Is it the literal body and blood of Jesus? Like, does it actually transform into flesh and blood? Is it some way that Jesus really does become present among his people, even if it's not literally his body and blood? Or is it really just a representation, a symbol that carries no additional weight than any other symbol or representation that we have in the church? What about who should take the Lord's Supper? Should it be only believers in Jesus? Should it be believers in Jesus who are baptized? Should it be believers in Jesus who are baptized and are members of this particular church? Should it be believers in Jesus who are baptized and members of this particular church and have lived a sinless, perfect life this past week, who have gained an A+ in holiness? Or is it for everyone? Can anyone take it? Questions about when should we do it? Should we do it every day, every week? Should we do it once a month? Should we do it like once a year? Like Christmas. Why would we spoil it by doing it more than once a year? I mean, that just takes away the excitement of it, right? Questions about how should we do it? Should we pass it through the aisles? Should we come up to the front and take it this way? Should we do it as part of a potluck meal? I've done that before. That was great. How should we do it? Can be a divisive question. And then for a lot of people who aren't even from the church, who aren't from Christian backgrounds, the question really is more like, what is the big deal? Like, you're eating a crumb of bread and you're drinking a little shot glass of grape juice. Like, what are you so worked up about? What is this thing that you make such a big deal of? I mean, across the board, there are just so many questions, so many approaches, so many strong convictions about what we do when we participate in the Lord's Supper. So this morning, I want to go back to the source. I want to go back to the original Lord's Supper, and I want to look at the meal that Jesus and the disciples ate. I want to look at the words that they spoke, the words that Jesus spoke, and I want to look at the disciples who ate the meal and listened to the words. So those are kind of the three movements we're going to do: the meal, the words, and the disciples. But in the midst of all of that, I'm hoping for two things. I'm hoping that at the most basic level, that you will gain a better understanding this morning of what we do when we participate in the Lord's Supper. I'm hoping that it will make more sense to you this morning, that getting into this text and getting into the first century context will help you gain a richer understanding of this. But second, at a bit more of an advanced level, I'm hoping and praying that you will actually be transformed by what we hear this morning. That you will see something new about who God is and about who you are, and that it will not just give you a little bit of information about what we do, but that it will actually change who you are. So let's read this. Let's open up our Bibles. Mark chapter 14 is where we find the original Lord's Supper. It's the Last Supper. This is probably the heading in your Bibles. Mark 14, verses 12 to 26. On the first day of the festival of unleavened bread, when it was customary to sacrifice the Passover lamb, Jesus' disciples asked him, "Where do you want us to go and make preparations for you to eat the Passover?" So he sent two of his disciples, telling them, "Go into the city, and a man carrying a jar of water will meet you. Follow him. Say to the owner of the house he enters, 'The teacher asks, "Where is my guest room where I may eat the Passover with my disciples?" He'll show you a large room upstairs, furnished and ready. Make preparations for us there." The disciples left. They went into the city, and they found things just as Jesus had told them. So they prepared the Passover. When evening came, Jesus arrived with the 12. And while they were reclining at the table eating, he said, "Truly I tell you, one of you will betray me, one who is eating with me." They were saddened, and one by one they said to him, "Surely you don't mean me." "It is one of the 12, he replied, "one who dips bread into the bowl with me. The Son of Man will go just as it is written about him. But woe to that man who betrays the Son of Man. It would be better for him if he had not been born." While they were eating, Jesus took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and gave it to his disciples, saying, "Take it, this is my body." Then he took a cup, and when he had given thanks, he gave it to them, and they all drank from it. "This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many," he said to them. "Truly I tell you, I will not drink again from the fruit of the vine until that day when I drink it new in the kingdom of God." And when they had sung a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. So first thing, we want to look at the meal that Jesus and the disciples eat together. What is this, actually? It's quite clear from Mark 14 that this is a Passover meal. That's what Mark tells us. They're supposed to go, they're supposed to prepare this Passover meal. That's the time of year we're dealing with. So what was the Passover meal? Well, let's talk about the elements of the meal first. This is a great setup here. Byron and Diane Grant kind of put this together for me, which I really appreciate. By the way, it's become somewhat fashionable for Christians in our day to participate in something called a Seder meal. And Seder is, it's the Passover meal, and it's lots of liturgy, lots of details, different kinds of readings, and all of that. A lot of what we have in the Seder meal, and it's great to do that. It's great for Christians to do that and get in touch with the first century Jewish roots. But a lot of what we have in the Seder meal comes to us a generation after Jesus. And so we don't know exactly what it looked like when Jesus and his disciples ate the meal. But it probably did consist of some of these elements. So the Passover meal likely was broken up into 4 parts. And those 4 parts were punctuated by 4 glasses of wine. During the meal, you would have also had bitter herbs that you would have eaten. A little bit of a different take on the whole salad appetizer kind of thing. You would have had a bowl of stewed fruit. Bread, of course, would have been a big part of it. And then the central main course of the meal was a lamb. And all of these elements pointed back to the Passover story in the book of Exodus. What happens in the life of Israel at that time? And I know some of you know this story, but I kind of want to recount it anyway so that we're all kind of on the same page here. For hundreds of years, the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, those 3 big patriarchs way back in the book of Genesis, their descendants had been slaves in the land of Egypt for hundreds of years. And you would imagine that as they were slaves, they would have heard stories of the God of their ancestors, of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and that they would have heard stories about how this God had promised their forefathers that he would provide them with a land of their own, that he would make them into a great nation. And here you are in the midst of slavery in Egypt, and all of that stuff seems really far off. And so you start crying out to God. You say, "God, you promised our ancestors this. Where are you? You got to come and help us." And God hears their cries. He hears their prayers, and he says, "Now is the time." So he raises up Moses, sends Moses to Pharaoh, and starts the process of loosening Pharaoh, the king of Egypt's, grip on Israel. And he does this primarily through a series of 10 plagues. And these plagues actually don't quite loosen Pharaoh's grip. In fact, they harden Pharaoh's heart to the point that God brings the 10th plague, which is by far the worst. And the 10th plague is that in every single home in Egypt, Israelite or Egyptian, no matter who they are, in every single home, the firstborn child will perish. The firstborn son will perish. But God offers a provision, a way out of this judgment. God says that any home, and he speaks this through Moses, that any home that takes a lamb and slaughters that lamb and takes the blood of that lamb and paints it on the door frame of their home will be spared this judgment, that this lamb will be sacrificed in place of the son in that home, and that when the angel of God comes through the land, that the angel will pass over those homes that have the blood of the lamb. Now, let me put this in a little bit of a different way, and this is owed to Tim Keller, a pastor and author in New York City. At that time, at the Passover, God's sword of divine justice is unsheathed. God is a God of justice, and our sin, our decisions to rebel against God, to reject Him, earns that judgment, that justice of God. So at the Passover, on that night, God's sword of judgment, of justice is unsheathed. However, everyone who finds shelter under the blood of a substitute has their life spared. That's what's going on in the book of Exodus. Everyone who finds shelter under the blood of a substitute, under the blood of the Lamb, is spared. Their life is spared. That's what's going on. So on the night of Passover, the angel comes through. Every home that has put their faith in the blood of the Lamb is spared, and then the other ones lose their firstborn son. And this, finally, is what loosens Pharaoh's grip. This is what it took to free Israel from slavery. And Pharaoh says, that's it, I've had enough. He sends them out, and while there are quite a few hiccups on the way, this eventually leads to Israel coming to the promised land, and God fulfilling His promises to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob many, many years before. And from then on, God tells the Israelites every single year, you are to celebrate the Passover meal. You are to remember what I did for you. And this is how you are to do it. You are to eat a meal like this. And every single element of this meal was meant to point them back to the Exodus, to remind them what God had done. So the 4 glasses of wine that kind of punctuated the phases of the meal were in relationship to these 4 promises in Exodus chapter 6, where God promised to free Israel from slavery, to release them from oppression, to redeem them, and to make them His people. So every one of these glasses of wine would have been drank at one of those, and that promise in particular would have been spoken. The bitter herbs they ate as a reminder of the bitterness of slavery in Egypt. They eat these, it's a bad taste. It's like that's what your forefathers experienced in Egypt when they were slaves there. The bowl of stewed fruit was supposed to have the color and consistency of clay, the material that the Israelites baked bricks out of in Egypt. So you look at it and you're like, that looks like what they had to bake bricks out of. That was the kind of the defining thing about their slavery. The bread was unleavened bread. And the idea here was that Israel, on the night of the Passover, didn't have time to make bread that was going to rise. They wasn't to have yeast in it. They were going to leave in haste. And so you ate this unleavened bread to remind yourselves of forefathers had to get out of Egypt as quick as they could. And then the central course of the meal was the lamb. And this lamb that was eaten every year on Passover reminded Israel of this substitute, this animal that had died in the place of the firstborn son in the homes of those ancestors, that this lamb was the sacrificial offering. Every single part of this meal points back to the Exodus. And you see a lot of these in Mark chapter 14. I mean, you read about the wine, you read about the bread, you read about them dipping into the bowl, probably of stewed fruit. But you know what Mark never really talks about in this meal? He doesn't talk about the lamb. At the beginning, he talks about how it's the customary time for the lamb to be sacrificed, but actually, he never mentions anything about them eating the lamb. He doesn't mention the main course. And they probably ate it because it's the Passover, and maybe it's just incidental, but I wonder if Mark doesn't talk about the lamb, because at this particular supper, the lamb who spares their life, the lamb who is given in place of them, isn't on the table. The lamb is at the table. The lamb is serving the meal. Now, I don't know if the disciples understood that quite yet. But Jesus was going to make it a bit more clear in the words that he was about to speak. So we've looked at the meal that they let's look at the words that Jesus speaks at this meal. And as we do that, I want to try to get us into the shoes of a first century Jewish person who's at a meal like this. These disciples are, let's say, 20, 25, maybe 30 years old. They're young guys, but every single year of their life, they have sat at a Passover meal, and they've heard the same words spoken again and again. It's predictable. They know what's going to happen. And I mean, it's deeply meaningful. It's deeply central to their identity, but it's also, again, deeply predictable and routine. They've seen this. They've done this many, many times before. Think about something in our culture that is deeply meaningful and yet also very predictable. It's kind of the same thing over and over again. I think about the national anthem as an example. When I was a kid, I'm pretty sure I remember this right, that every single day we started the day by singing Canada's national anthem. We obviously sing it at Canada Day. Most of us do. You'll sing it at sports games. At the beginning of every sports game in Canada, you'll have the national anthem. And there are certain routines and rituals that are part of this. You know the words that are going to be sung. They're more or less the same unless the government tells us that they're different. But they give us some advance notice about that and everything. So more or less they're the same words. And it's done in the kind of the same way. And if you're at a sports game, you see the flag and you take off your hat. Maybe you put your hand on your chest if you're especially patriotic. It's the same kind of thing over and over again, and even when it's a little bit different, it's like predictably different. So, like, I haven't watched a Canucks game in like 8 years, but I remember back then, there was the guy who would sing the national anthem, and then like 3/4 of the way, he would just decide his work was done, and then he'd hold up the microphone, and everybody else would sing. And I just hope that he only got 75% of his paycheck. I always watch that, and I'm like, you're not even doing your full job. You're supposed to sing the whole thing. Just making everybody else do it. Anyways, but it was predictable, right? You know what's happening. You know the drill here. And it's deeply meaningful, especially if you're patriotic, but it's also very predictable. So imagine that you're at a sports game and you're singing the national anthem. It's kind of the same. It's the same thing. It's the same routine you've gone through over and over again. And you're singing like, "Oh, Canada, our home and native land," and on and on. And then you get to the end, and your hearts are swelling, and you're just like, "Yeah, I'm loving this." And all of a sudden, the singer goes, "Oh, Mexico, we give our lives to you." What? Where did Mexico come from? What are you doing here? That's not the song. I don't have anything against Mexico, but that's not the song. You can't change it like that. That's not how this goes. That's a little bit what it's like at the Last Supper. Not that Jesus says anything that's treasonous or anything like that, but that the predictable routine is broken pretty dramatically and significantly by Jesus. So he's going through the meal, and it looks like it's probably at the beginning of the third course of the meal. So the first 2 glasses of wine have been drunk. At the beginning of the third course of the meal, the host would take some of the unleavened bread, and they would break it, and they would speak a blessing over it. And the blessing, it looks like, from evidence, was something like, "This is the bread of affliction which our fathers in Egypt ate." And this is a quote from Deuteronomy chapter 16, actually. Deuteronomy 16 says that the Israelites are to eat the bread of affliction because you left Egypt in haste. That's the kind of thing that they're speaking. This is the bread of affliction which your fathers ate in Egypt. Now, I don't know if Jesus says that or not when he serves this, but he breaks it and he says, "Take it. This is my body." This is my body. Nobody said that. They've sat in these Passover meals year after year after year. They've seen Jesus do it probably a couple times before. I don't think anybody's ever said this before. Take it, this is my body. I mean, do you feel the shock, even just from like the unpredictability of it? Now, what does Jesus mean by that? Well, I would argue, along with a whole bunch of New Testament scholars, that to think that when Jesus said that, he meant, look at this is now literally my flesh, and you're going to eat my flesh, it probably was beyond the scope of what a Jewish person in the first century would have understood. That would have been a little bit beyond their understanding. What they would have understood, again, is going back to Deuteronomy 16 and the way this bread was described. It's the bread of affliction. It's the bread that reminds you of how the Israelites were oppressed, how they were enslaved, and how God broke that slavery and that oppression. That's what they're hearing during this part of the meal. And now Jesus says, not that this is the bread of the affliction of your forefathers, but this is my body. The bread of affliction is now his body. In other words, he's taking the affliction, the oppression, the enslavery of the Israelites into himself, into his own body. He is going to bear it in himself. What Jesus is announcing here is that he is bringing about a whole new exodus. That there is this thing that they've been practicing, remembering for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, and he's saying, something brand new is happening tonight. It's a new exodus, and it's happening in my body. I'm taking the oppression, the affliction, the slavery, all that stuff. I'm taking that into my own body. And then Jesus would have kept on going. So they would have eaten the meal, the main course. They would have had the lamb, and then at the end of that part of the meal is when they would have taken the third cup. And this is where Jesus takes this third cup in the Passover meal. And instead of speaking, again, the traditional expected words that would have been spoken at this time, Jesus says, this is my blood of the covenant. Again, nobody said that. This is the blood of my covenant. What are you talking about? Jesus says, this is my blood of the covenant. Now, this covenant language is important. So try to follow with me, track with me on this. So he talks about the covenant. And there's language about the covenant in the Exodus. This is an important concept, this agreement, this arrangement, this relationship that God forms with his people where there are obligations and promises made on both sides. Right? So God saves Israel. He redeems them. He's faithful to his promises, but now they come to Mount Sinai after the Exodus, and God gives them his instructions, gives them his commands, and the expectation is that Israel will now live up to those instructions, which are all about how do you live as God wants you to live. How do you reflect his character, his image? He's saved you. He's redeemed you. Now you need to look like him in the way you live so others will know him as well. And by the way, that's always the logical flow of salvation, that we are saved by grace, that God delivers us and rescues us. But the point is not just to give us a free ticket to heaven, but to actually restore us, to make us again who he made us to be, image bearers, reflecting his character. So that's what Mount Sinai is all about. It's this covenant, this arrangement. Hey, I've saved you. Now here is how you need to live. And to seal that covenant, in Exodus 24, Moses takes a whole bunch of animals and he sacrifices them, and now he's got a whole bunch of blood. And do you know what he does with all of that blood? He sprinkles it on the people, which gives a whole new meaning to the term bloodbath. Moses sprinkles it on the people. Now, why does he sprinkle it on the people? Why do they get blood all over them? Well, this is how covenants were sealed in the ancient world, and the idea was, just as there's blood on me, this is what is to happen to me if I don't uphold my end of the deal. If I don't keep the covenant, then may this happen to me. May my blood be shed. That's the idea. That's the logic behind it. And it's actually, there's another example, a great example in Genesis chapter 15, where God is making the covenant with Abraham about giving him a land and giving him ancestors or descendants and so on. to take a bunch of animals and to kill them and to divide them in half. And to put them on, to divide these halves and put them on either side. And then God causes Abraham to fall into a deep sleep. And then the presence of God, the presence and glory of God passes between the pieces of the animals, which is so incredibly powerful because God is unilaterally saying, may this happen to me if I don't uphold my end of the deal here. This is how serious I am, Abraham, about the promises I'm making to you. That may, not that God could be divided, not that God could be destroyed, but he's saying, may this happen to me if I don't uphold my end of the deal. He's this serious about it. So this is the kind of thing that happens with covenants. Now, if you know the Old Testament story, you'll know that Israel doesn't do a very good job of it, that Israel doesn't uphold their end of the deal very well, which gave rise to a prophetic hope inspired by God that one day God would make a new covenant with the people. A new covenant that would not be a superficial morality, but would be deeply rooted in people's hearts. So Jeremiah 31, God speaks through Jeremiah and says, I will make a new covenant. It will not be like the covenant I made with their ancestors. I will put my law in their minds and write it on their hearts. They will all know me from the least of them to the greatest. I'm going to put my law on their minds, in their hearts. It's going to be deeply transformative. So now take that thought and look at what happens here. So in Exodus 24, the blood of the covenant is sprinkled on the people. It's an external covering. It's a superficial covering, just like their adherence to the covenant was mostly a superficial external thing. Jesus gives them the wine. He says, this is my blood of the covenant, and then he gives it to them to drink it. And again, it's not that they're literally drinking his blood, but that the blood of the covenant is now going inside of them. It's not an external sprinkling. It's going deep within. The blood of this lamb is cleansing them from the inside out and enabling them, empowering them to live faithfully in a way that they haven't been before. That's, I think, what Jesus is saying. It's fulfilled especially in the Holy Spirit, who is poured out on us, in us, and empowers us to live the life that God calls us to live. But that's what's happening at the Last Supper. Jesus says that you had the blood of the covenant before on you. Now it's going to be in you. What we read in Jeremiah 31 is now coming true. Now that's pretty heady stuff, isn't it? I mean, that here at the Last Supper, these are the kinds of things Jesus is saying. I'm doing a new exodus in my own body. My blood being shed is bringing about this covenant that we've been promised for years and years, that you're going to be cleansed from the inside out. This is pretty heady stuff. And some of you might hear that and you might go, I don't think I can do this. I mean, I can't live up to that. This whole inside-out, deeply rooted love for the Lord, I don't know if I experience that very often. I know I fall short and fail, so I don't think I'm worthy of this meal. Let's talk about that. We've talked about the meal that they ate. We've talked about the words that Jesus spoke. Let's talk about the disciples who do all this. Let's look at this last part of the meal. This whole meal is framed by failure on the part of the disciples, isn't it? The passage right before this one that David spoke on last week, Judas is so ticked by mismanagement of funds in his view that he goes and he betrays Jesus. He goes and basically says, I will help you catch Jesus. Just give me a little bit of money and I'll help you do this. So that's kind of right before the story. As they're eating the meal, right during the meal, Jesus says, one of you is going to betray me. And it's not one of the periphery people. It's not one of the people who are maybe on the fringes. It's one of you. It's one of the 12. It's one of my insiders. It's one of the people who knows me best. You're going to betray me. Jesus announces this to the disciples. This whole meal is framed by treachery. And you'll go, well, okay, fine, that's fine, but that's Judas. that Judas, he wasn't redeemed. And Jesus himself says, woe to him. It'd be better for him if he wasn't born. So no, we're not going to take any example from Judas. Fine, I'll grant you that. But look at the rest of the disciples. Mark, I think he's the only one of the gospel writers who has this little note that when Jesus gives them the wine, they all drank from it. Verse 23, they all drank from it. You know what else they all did? Just a few verses later, verse 27, Jesus says, you will all fall away. And then in verse 50, when Jesus is arrested, and we'll look at this in a few weeks, everyone, all his disciples deserted him and fled. It's not just Judas. It's all of the disciples who fall away, who flee the scene, who fail. And they're all the ones who drink the cup. They're all the ones who participate in this original Lord's Supper. You see, I look at this, and I think that the Lord's Supper is all about grace. From start to finish, it is all about grace. It is the Lamb, the sacrificial Lamb who dies in our place, under whose blood we find shelter. That's grace. That's nothing we deserve. That's just grace. Jesus takes the bread of affliction, our oppression, our slavery, our hardships. He takes that into his own body. He bears that in himself. That's all grace. The blood of the covenant, that Jesus sheds his blood so that our sins can be forgiven, so that we can be renewed. It's all grace. And then you look at these disciples, you look at these guys who apparently were the ones Jesus wanted to do this with the first time, and they all fall short. They all have their foibles. They all are weak. They all have their shortcomings, and it's for them. This meal, fundamentally, primarily, is for people who know that they need the grace of Jesus. It is not for the people who have lived a sinless, perfect life this past week. It is for people who know that they need the grace of Jesus. And this is such good news for all of us. It's good news for me because I look at my life and I think about myself as a pastor in particular, and I think there's so many things that I should do and should say that I don't, and things that I shouldn't do or say that I do. And if this church is to be based, if its strength is to be based on my sinless perfection, then we're in major trouble. If you're looking for a church where nobody ever does or says anything that rubs you the wrong way, well, I think our attendance is going to be quite a bit lower next week because this isn't the place for you. You see, what we're founded on is not the perfection of a leader or any group of leaders. What we're founded on is the grace of Jesus. This is good news for all of us. It's good news for you because I'm willing to wager that you haven't lived a sinless, perfect life either. This meal is for you. Now, it's not. I want to bring in something else here too, because it's not just for those who need grace. There's another element to this too. I worked with a pastor once who would say, when he served communion, he would say, there are only two kinds of people who should not participate in this. People who think that they're good enough to do it, and people who don't think that they're good enough to do it. Now, at first, you're like, well, that doesn't work very well. That doesn't leave a whole lot of people left to take this. What he meant by that was, first of all, that people who think that they've somehow earned the right to the grace of Jesus, that they've somehow worked their way up to this, that this isn't for them. Jesus came not for those who think that they're healthy and well, but he came for the sinners. He came for the sick. So if you think that you're good enough for the grace of God, then this isn't for you. Don't bother with it. But then on the flip side, it's not for those who don't think they're good enough. And what he meant by that was that if you look at your life and you think, well, I'm so messed up and I'm so broken that I'm beyond the scope of this. I'm not even going to come to the table because I'm beyond God's grace. I've messed up too much for that. I doubt that God could even love me. Well, you need this, but you probably won't take it because you've written yourself off. This meal and what Jesus does here is for those who know that they needed the grace of Jesus and are willing to take hold of it, willing to grab onto it, willing to trust it. I want to bring one more thing into this discussion. Is that okay? Are you okay with that? Because I'm doing it anyway. I mean, it doesn't really matter what you say. This past week, one of the big news stories that a lot of you would have seen was this rescue on Grouse Mountain, where this boy was, I'm not sure exactly how it happened, but he was hanging off the chairlift, and his dad was kind of holding him by his hood and by his arm, but he's like hanging off the chairlift. And it looked pretty bad. I mean, he was pretty high up, and the dad wasn't able to get him back on. And this group of teenage boys saw this happening, and just incredibly, I'm just like, it blows me away, but they grab some of that protective snow fencing, and they hold it underneath, and then they grab one of the crash pads from the chairlift poles, I think it was, and they put it on top, and they tell the boy to kick off his skis, which he does, and then they convince the dad to trust them enough to let the son go. And if you saw the video, you'll have seen this, how the son falls and lands in this protective netting. At this point, there's like 6 or 8 teenagers or whatever who are all holding this thing, and the boy is totally uninjured. He's totally fine. What looked like disaster gets averted because of the courage of these teenage boys. And I look at that and I think, man, isn't that an incredible picture? How this boy's hanging from the chairlift, hanging on for dear life, and I hope that this isn't too much of a stretch, but I think biblically speaking, that's our situation. That because of our foibles, because of our shortcomings, because of our iniquities, our trespasses, our sins, whatever you want to call them, we're hanging on by a thread. It's not looking good for us. In fact, it looks like destruction is on its way. That's the judgment, that's the justice, that's the natural result of the situation we find ourselves in. We're hanging there, and we're not able to get back up. We're not able to get ourselves back up, and no other human is going to be able to do it for us either. But then along comes Jesus. And by his grace, he says, look, I'm strong enough. I can catch you. If you trust me enough to let go, I can catch you. But you have to be willing to actually let go. You have to be willing to actually trust that you're not going to be able to get yourself back up, but that instead, that the way out of this is to trust in the strength of Jesus. This meal and what Jesus did, that Passover, is for those who know that they need the grace of Jesus and who are willing to let go of their attempts at justifying themselves through their good works, through their appearance, through their money, through whatever it is that you try to save yourself. It's for people who know desperately that they need the grace of Jesus and are willing to let go of all of that stuff and trust in him alone. And invite the servers and the worship team up, and we'll pray, and then we'll respond to this message.